the secret test at Kummersdorf, and the day German tankers realized the war had changed forever. On the morning of September 14th, 1944, a pale sun rose over the Kummersdorf proving grounds, casting long shadows across a landscape scarred by years of secret weapons testing. The air was cool, quiet, and deceptively peaceful. But for Hauptmann Klaus Becker, a veteran tanker who had survived the furnace of Kursk and the chaos of Normandy, this was a morning he would never forget. It was the day he came face to face with a machine that simply should not have existed, a machine that would shake the very core of German armored doctrine. Becker stood beside the captured American vehicle, studying it with equal parts confusion and disbelief. The M18 Hellcat, the Americans called it a tank destroyer, though at first glance it looked more like a metal skeleton than a weapon of war. Its armor was so thin he could see daylight through bullet holes left by American infantry. He ran a gloved hand across its hull, feeling not the cold, reassuring thickness of steel he knew from Panthers and Panzer IVs, but something fragile, almost delicate. This defied everything he'd been taught. German tank design was built on a proud tradition, machines forged to dominate through firepower, protection, and discipline. Panthers were 45-ton beasts, angled armor so thick it could turn aside Soviet rounds. Their guns could reach out across the battlefield with ruthless precision. Everything about German doctrine focused on superiority, superior optics, superior steel, superior range. But this machine, this lightly armored, almost reckless American vehicle, it weighed a mere 18 tons, less than half of Becker's Panther. By every German measurement of what a tank destroyer must be, the Hellcat was the wrong answer to every question. And yet, the Americans were using it. More than that, they were winning with it. Stacks of captured American reports lay on Becker's desk, and he'd read them all, page by page, night after night. The numbers made no sense. The M18 Hellcat, this thin-skinned racer on tracks, was achieving kill ratios of more than 2 German tanks destroyed for every Hellcat lost. It was outperforming expectations so dramatically that Becker initially suspected exaggeration or propaganda. But American soldiers did not brag in their after-action logs. They simply recorded what happened. And what happened, over and over again, was this. A Hellcat arrived fast, hit fast, and disappeared before German tanks could even react. Now the question fell to Becker and his team at Kummersdorf. How? How could something so vulnerable, so flimsy by German standards, be so effective? As he prepared to test the vehicle, Becker felt a heaviness he could not quite name. He had been a tanker since the early days of the Eastern Front. He had watched friends die to Soviet shells. He had battled in fields of fire and mud where maneuver meant survival and hesitation meant death. He had seen the Panthers' magnificent, terrible machines break down under strain, fall behind in deep snow, or simply run out of fuel when the front shifted too fast. But he had never encountered anything like the Hellcat. Later that morning, Becker climbed down into the driver's position. Even there, in the cramped steel interior, he sensed something different. The controls were simple, shockingly simple. Where German tanks demanded finesse and strength, this American machine practically invited him to press forward, to push harder, to see what happened if he didn't hold back. The engine started with a snarl, its 9 cylinders roaring to life behind him. Becker pushed the throttle. The Hellcat surged forward. It didn't move, it leaped. It accelerated with a raw, animal energy he had never felt in any armored vehicle. 20 miles per hour came and went in seconds, then 30, then 40. Becker felt his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't a tank. It was something closer to a racing machine wrapped in steel. At 55 miles per hour, he eased off not because the vehicle was struggling, but because he was. The speed was intoxicating, thrilling, terrifying. He had driven Panthers across all kinds of terrain. He had fought in forests, cities, open plains, but nothing, not even on the best roads in France, had prepared him for the sensation of commanding a fully armed combat vehicle that moved like this. When he finally brought the Hellcat to a stop, the silence around him seemed louder than the engine ever had. He sat there, hands trembling slightly, trying to reconcile what he had seen, what he had felt, with everything he knew, everything he believed about armored warfare. Just then, Oberleutnant Werner Schulz, his second in command, a man as seasoned and stoic as any tanker in the Wehrmacht, took the controls for his own test run. When Schulz returned, His expression said everything. For the first time in Becker's career, he saw genuine uncertainty in a veteran's eyes. Later that day, Schultz would describe the Hellcat in a way Becker would record carefully in his notes. "It is not a tank destroyer," Schultz said quietly. "It is a mechanized ambush. You cannot fight it the way we fight tanks. By the time you see it, it's already gone." That single sentence, the whisper of a truth the German army had been unwilling to acknowledge, cut deeper than any shell. Because Becker knew, in that moment, that the war on the Western Front was changing, not because American armor was stronger, not because their guns were bigger, but because their thinking, their philosophy, was different. They had built a machine not to survive hits, but to avoid them, not to slug forward, but to strike fast, not to dominate a battlefield through fear, but through speed, initiative, and boldness. What Becker felt that day at Kummersdorf was not admiration, though part of him respected the ingenuity. It was not fear, though he believed German tankers would soon feel plenty of it. What he felt was something heavier, the realization that Germany was fighting a war designed for a world that no longer existed, while the Americans were fighting the war of the future. And standing beside that thin-skinned Hellcat sunlight glinting off its battered armor, Klaus Becker understood a truth he wished he'd never had to write in his report. This vehicle represents a tactical philosophy we cannot match. The trials that shocked the German High Command, when speed defeated steel. The following day, September 15th, 1944, the proving grounds at Kummersdorf stirred awake under a grey autumn sky. Overnight, mist had gathered low to the earth, drifting like pale ribbons across the open testing field. Soldiers shuffled between hangars, clipboard-bearing officers prepared stopwatches and rangefinders, and mechanics warmed the engines of several German tanks brought in for comparison. But all eyes, everyone's eyes, were on the American machine. The M18 Hellcat sat waiting, its long 76mm gun pointing skyward like a challenge. Thin armor, light frame, open-topped turret, nothing about it looked intimidating. It was an underdog, surrounded by giants. A Panther stood beside it like a wall of steel, 45 tons of German pride. Heavy armor sloped with mathematical precision, a machine engineered to dominate. A Panzer IV idled nearby, the veteran workhorse of countless battles. Even a captured Soviet T-34 was present, its rugged silhouette reminding the Germans how the war had shifted after 1941. Yet on this morning, something felt different. Something electric was in the air. As the mist thinned, Becker's team climbed aboard their machines. They weren't just testing vehicles, they were testing ideologies. Every nation in this war had designed its tanks based on its own beliefs. What mattered most, what a tank should be, what a crew needed to survive. And for Germany, that belief had always been armor, thick, angled, unforgiving armor. But today, they were about to learn what it meant to face a different kind of weapon, a weapon built on a philosophy completely opposite to their own. The mobility trials begin. A whistle blew. Engines roared. The field came alive. The first test ran across soft ground soil churned by weeks of rain, the kind that often trapped Panthers in the mud of the Eastern Front. German tanks moved carefully, their weight sinking slightly with each meter. The Panther's engine growled as it fought for traction. Then the Hellcat moved. Light, sure-footed, and astonishingly quick, it glided across the terrain like it weighed nothing at all. Where the Panther dug ruts, the Hellcat danced. Even Becker, standing with a clipboard, couldn't hide his surprise. A lieutenant beside him muttered, "It moves like it's floating, like it doesn't understand it's a tank." Opa. The numbers didn't lie. The Hellcat crossed the test zone 24% faster than the Panther, and this was only the beginning. Into the forest. Next came the wooded coarse-thick tree clusters, narrow paths carved between trunks, the kind of terrain where Panthers often struggled to maneuver. The Panther's width forced it to slow, carefully threading between obstacles. The Panzer IV did better, but still crawled cautiously. Then the Hellcat entered the forest. Its narrow frame slipped between trees with fluid grace. Branches brushed its hull, leaves scattered in its wake, and within seconds it had vanished deeper into the woods, too fast for the observers to track visually. Becker's stopwatch told a story the German officers did not want to hear. The Hellcat moved through the forest nearly twice as fast as the Panther. Schultz, standing beside Becker, gave a low whistle. His voice was quiet, thoughtful. "Speed like this, it changes everything. This isn't a tank, it's a hunter." The road trial, where the Hellcat became a legend. Finally came the moment that would define the entire test program. A 2-mile stretch of straight roadway, normally used only for controlled speed trials, was cleared. Officers lined the edges with binoculars. Mechanics held notebooks open. This was the trial everyone had been waiting for. A German major raised a red flag. Panther, prepare to advance. Ate it, my firster. The Panther's engine thundered, exhaust pipes rumbling like distant thunder. The flag dropped. The Panther lunged forward, its heavy frame gaining speed slowly, steadily, pushing toward its top road speed of 30 miles per hour. Cheers rose among the crew as it reached its limit. Then came the Hellcat. Becker climbed into the turret, Schultz taking the driver's seat. The engine was warm, humming like a caged animal ready to burst free. On your signal, Herr Hauptmann, the major said. Becker nodded. The red flag dropped. Schultz pushed the throttle. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. The Hellcat didn't accelerate, it detonated forward like a shot from its own gun. Dust exploded behind it. The entire vehicle shuddered under raw momentum. Within seconds it overtook the Panther, streaking past it like a motorcycle passing a tractor. Officers gasped. Mechanics swore out loud. Even Becker grabbed the railing to steady himself as the machine surged faster, faster, faster still. 40 miles per hour. 45. 50. At 55 miles per hour, Schultz eased off the throttle, hands shaking, adrenaline thrumming through him. The Hellcat could still go faster, but the human behind the controls had reached his limit. When they returned, an eerie quiet fell over the entire proving ground. One German captain finally broke the silence. 55 miles per hour. In a combat vehicle? Nobody answered. They all knew what it meant. The turret trials. When the Hellcat outpaced German reflexes, that afternoon they tested turret rotation. German engineers prided themselves on precision turret mechanisms, especially on the Panther, whose electric motor was one of the most advanced in the world. But precision came at a cost. Time. The Panther's full turret rotation required 35 seconds. The Hellcat did it in under 20. Schultz spoke the words everyone was thinking. By the time we turn to face it, it has already fired, already moved, already vanished. A philosophy Germany was never prepared to face. As the sun dipped low behind the tree line, Becker gathered his notes. The numbers were undeniable. The machine's strengths were undeniable. Its philosophy was undeniable. Speed had defeated steel. Mobility had outclassed armor. And the Americans, those practical, inventive soldiers halfway across the world, had built a weapon designed not to duel, but to dictate the battle. A weapon that refused to fight on German terms. With a heavy heart, Becker prepared to write the line he dreaded most. This vehicle represents a tactical philosophy we cannot match with existing doctrine. For the first time in the war, the Germans faced not just a better machine, but a better idea. Ghosts on the battlefield, when the Hellcat became the phantom German tankers feared. There are moments in every soldier's life when the enemy stops being an opponent and becomes something else, something harder to understand, harder to fight, something that steals sleep from tired eyes and gnaws at the mind long after the battle has ended. For German tank crews fighting in France, Belgium, and across the forests of Western Europe in 1944, that something had a name. They called it Der Geist, the ghost, and the ghost had an American star painted on its hull. The first rumors. Long before Becker and Schultz tested the Hellcat at Kummersdorf, unsettling stories were drifting back from the front lines. Panther crews, some of the finest armored soldiers Germany had, were reporting encounters with American tank destroyers that moved too fast to track, struck with pinpoint accuracy, and vanished before German gunners could even rotate their turrets. At first, High Command dismissed these stories as exaggeration fragments of panic from units in retreat, or poor radio coordination, or simple confusion in the chaos of battle. But the stories kept coming, and they all shared the same haunting detail. It hit us, and then it was gone. Normandy's bocage, a perfect hunting ground. In the summer of 1944, the bocage country of Normandy became a battleground unlike any other in Europe. Thick hedgerows, some centuries old, split the land into mazes of earth, vegetation, and narrow lanes. To German tanks like the Panther, these hedgerows were suffocating. A Panther could dominate a field, but in the bocage, it often couldn't see 10 yards ahead. But for the Hellcat, the bocage was heaven. Its small frame slipped between narrow farm tracks. Its lightweight let it reverse or accelerate faster than any German tanker had imagined possible. And its speed gave American crews something priceless: the choice of when and where to fight. One German commander later wrote, "They were everywhere, we were not. When we turned our guns, they were gone. When we relaxed, they returned." The most chilling example came in August 1944, near the Falaise pocket. The Panther column that never saw it coming. A column of Panthers was making its way down a narrow lane bordered by hedgerows. The formation was textbook perfect, every vehicle spaced properly, turrets scanning for threats, infantry escort moving ahead. The commander, a veteran of the Eastern Front, had survived firefights against Soviet T-34 seconds, duels across frozen plains, and ambushes near Kursk. He believed he understood tank warfare better than most men alive, but he had never faced a Hellcat. The first warning came not from the front where German eyes were focused, but from the right, through a narrow gap the Germans had dismissed as too small to matter. A flash, a crack, a roar of an explosion. The lead Panther vanished in a burst of flame, hit cleanly in the side armor. Before anyone could react, the Hellcat that had fired was already reversing into the hedge, disappearing into a tunnel of green as if swallowed by the earth itself. The Germans deployed infantry. They swept the hedgerows. They waited for reinforcements. 15 minutes later, another Panther at the rear of the column exploded, this time from a shot fired from an entirely different direction. Somewhere, unseen, a Hellcat was circling them, fast enough to reposition while the Germans were still reorganizing. By the end of the 45-minute engagement, 4 Panthers burned. 1 was crippled. Not a single German had even seen the Hellcat clearly. To them, it simply appeared and vanished. Just like a ghost. "We are hunting a ghost," the words that reached Berlin. At Kummersdorf, Becker later read a transcript from that very battle. It contained a message written by Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, a respected Panther commander. His words were short, but they carried the raw exhaustion of a soldier facing something his training had never prepared him for. "We are hunting a ghost. I can hear it, sometimes see a shadow of it, but I cannot bring my gun to bear before it disappears. Our armor means nothing if the enemy refuses to stand and fight." Becker had fought in Kursk, where tank duels were brutal and direct. Men faced each other in open fields, where skill, armor, and firepower decided victory. But here, on the Western Front, the rules had changed. The enemy wasn't standing toe-to-toe. The enemy was choosing the ground, the moment, and the angle of attack, and no German tank could follow. Not the Panther. Not the Tiger. Not anything Germany had ever built. Belgium and the fall of confidence. By October 1944, the psychological toll was becoming obvious. German letters and diary entries, many captured by Allied forces, showed a growing anxiety among tankers. One soldier from the 2nd Panzer Division wrote to his wife, "The Americans no longer fight like Russians. They do not come in waves. They appear where we do not expect them. They strike our sides, our rear, and then vanish. It is like war against smoke. Provitu." Another wrote, "I fear the fast ones. I fear the machines that do not stay to fight." German armored culture, for decades, had emphasized courage, the courage to stand, to duel, to overpower the enemy through discipline and firepower. But what do you do when the enemy is faster than your reflexes? When the battlefield becomes a chessboard where the opponent moves twice as fast? Why the Hellcat terrified them? It wasn't the gun. Germany had bigger guns. It wasn't the armor. The Hellcat had almost none. It was the freedom the Hellcat gave its crew. Freedom to choose the fight. Freedom to strike first. Freedom to flee before danger materialized. Freedom to turn the battlefield into a place where German strength became irrelevant. War is not only physical, it is psychological. And the Hellcat, with its 55 miles per hour's speed, with its sudden appearance and sudden disappearance, with its ability to destroy and slip away unseen, had become something Germany's tankers feared more deeply than any heavily armored foe. It had become the enemy they could not catch, the enemy they could not predict, the enemy that robbed them of certainty, the ghost. When steel could not save them, Germany's desperate search for answers. By late September 1944, the findings from Kummersdorf reached the desks of senior German officers, men who had spent their lives believing in the supremacy of steel, armor, and engineering perfection. They were men shaped by the Eastern Front, by hard-won duels against T-34 seconds and KV-1 second, by years of combat that taught them one iron rule: survival belonged to the machine that could take the hit. But the Hellcat had shattered that rule, and the consequences of that revelation rippled through the German high command like a silent shockwave. Reports arrived from France, Belgium, Luxembourg, stories of ambushes, of sudden losses, of panicked radio calls followed by silence. Panther crews who once rode forward with confidence were now requesting infantry screens, air reconnaissance, or simply refusing to pursue retreating American forces, because pursuit against the Hellcat meant suicide. But Berlin still demanded answers. They demanded countermeasures. They demanded a way to stop the American ghost. Becker and Schultz were summoned to draft tactical responses. Men who had once shaped doctrine through certainty and pride were now writing in the margins of their reports phrases like, "if fuel allows," "only possible with infantry support," or "not recommended under current conditions." Germany still had brilliant tacticians. They no longer had the resources to apply their brilliance. The doctrine that no longer fit the battlefield. For years, German armoured doctrine had been built on principles that felt almost sacred. Hold strong defensive lines. Engage the enemy at long range. Use superior optics and armour to dominate. Force the adversary to commit to frontal assault. Against the Soviets, this doctrine was brutally effective. Panthers positioned on ridgelines could tear through waves of Soviet armour long before T-34 seconds came within lethal range. Against British Churchill tanks or Cromwells, German gunners felt equally confident. But the Hellcat refused to participate in this duel. It did not present a frontal target. It did not offer a decisive engagement. It did not stay long enough for German strengths to matter. Instead, it appeared on the flank where the Panther's heavy armour did not protect it. Or it struck supply lines, or ambushed at dusk and vanished into the tree line before reinforcements arrived. The Germans were playing chess. The Americans were playing tag, resources Germany no longer possessed. Becker's final recommendations were sober, logical, even elegant in theory. Do not pursue the Hellcat, its speed guarantees failure. Establish static defensive lines, with overlapping fields of fire. Deploy infantry screens to prevent close-range ambush. Use air reconnaissance constantly to spot Hellcat positions. Conserve fuel. Every unnecessary maneuver risks immobilization. On paper, it was the correct response. In reality, it was impossible. By autumn 1944, the German army was held together by threads. Fuel shortages crippled movement. Many Panthers sat motionless for days. Infantry numbers had plummeted across every front. Air reconnaissance was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe had been all but swept from the sky. Artillery ammunition was rationed. Some units had to mark "out of shells" on their daily reports. Trained crews were dying faster than new ones could be trained. The Hellcat didn't just exploit tactical weaknesses, it exploited the collapse of German logistics, the exhaustion of German manpower, the suffocation of German air power. It exploited reality. No doctrine, no matter how clever, could change that. A fight German tankers knew they were losing. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, German officers again encountered Hellcats, this time as swift defenders rushing to plug holes in the American lines. Oberleutnant Werner Schultz, Becker's old second-in-command, saw it firsthand. His Panther company had advanced through the Belgian woods near Bastogne, pushing deeper than expected. For a few hours, they believed they had opened a breakthrough. Then Hellcats appeared not ahead of them, but behind. They had let the Panthers pass. They had waited, hidden and silent, and then struck the supply column trailing behind. 3 trucks were burning by the time Schultz turned his Panthers around. Ammunition cooked off in the flames. Smoke filled the forest. The road back was blocked with wreckage. The Hellcats were gone. In a 1952 interview, Schultz said, "It was exactly what we predicted at Kummersdorf. We were powerful, but blind. They were not powerful, but everywhere." Those words carried the weight of defeat not on the battlefield, but in spirit, because for the first time, Schultz and countless German tankers realized they were facing more than a machine. They were facing a style of warfare, a style Germany could not copy, a style Germany no longer had the fuel, the manpower, the sky, or the industry to match. The emotional toll. German tankers had always believed in fighting with honor, steel against steel, skill against skill, courage against courage. They believed in trading blows, holding ground, meeting the enemy head-on. The Hellcat violated that belief. To many German tankers, its tactics felt unfair. Not dishonorable war had stripped them of such illusions, but unsettling, disturbing, even demoralizing. One Panther gunner wrote in his diary, "We cannot fight what we cannot catch. We cannot strike what does not stay. It is not war as we learned it. It is something new." And he was right. War had changed. Speed was winning. Mobility was beating armor. Surprise was replacing brute force. Germany's heavy tanks, once symbols of unstoppable power, were now slow-moving monuments of a fading era. A bitter realization. When Becker finalized his report to Berlin on September 23, 1944, he wrote a sentence that summed up the entire German predicament. "The Hellcat makes our strength irrelevant. Armor meant nothing if the enemy never shot at you. Firepower meant nothing if the enemy never sat still long enough to be hit. Discipline and training meant nothing if the enemy vanished between shots." Germany had built its doctrine on survivability. America had built its doctrine on not being there when the shell landed. And in the twilight of 1944, the Germans understood the harsh truth. They were being outmaneuvered, outpaced, outthought. Not because they lacked courage, but because war had evolved and they had not. The final truth, when Germany faced the future and the Hellcat redefined the battlefield. By the final months of 1944, the German army, once the most feared armored force on earth, stood face to face with a truth it could no longer deny. The M18 Hellcat was not just a fast tank destroyer. It was not just an anomaly in American design. It was a symbol of something far larger, far more transformative. It represented the future, a future where speed mattered more than steel, where mobility mattered more than mass, where industrial power mattered more than technical perfection, and where doctrine once carved into stone could be upended by a single machine that dared to break every rule. For German officers who grew up believing that armored warfare was defined by thick armor, long guns, and perfect firing lines, this realization was painful, almost heartbreaking, because it meant everything they had built, everything they had sacrificed for, everything they had believed in, was slipping into the past. The bitter aftermath of Kummersdorf. When Becker completed his reports and passed them up the chain of command, the words were classified immediately. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were devastating. He had written, "The Hellcat is not superior because it is stronger. It is superior because it refuses to fight the war we trained for." Berlin understood the implication. The Americans weren't just fielding new weapons, they were fielding a new philosophy of warfare. A philosophy powered by an industrial engine Germany simply could not match. A philosophy made possible only by a nation that could produce, replace, and improve equipment faster than its enemies could destroy it. The Germans could not afford mistakes. The Americans could afford experiments. And in that difference lay the outcome of the war. The strategic reality Germany could not escape. By the end of 1944, German factories were reduced to rubble. Fuel reserves could barely keep tanks running for a day. Experienced crews were gone, replaced by boys who had never fired a gun before seeing battle. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, and every Panther destroyed represented weeks, sometimes months, of irreplaceable industrial effort. Meanwhile, America was producing 2,700 Hellcats, faster than Germany could produce a few hundred Panthers, at one-third the cost, using engines and parts common to multiple vehicles, with crews trained in a system that valued adaptation over rigid doctrine. The Hellcat did not need to survive every battle. It only needed to survive long enough to do its job, because for every Hellcat knocked out, 3 more rolled off the assembly line before the smoke cleared. Germany never had that luxury. The post-war reflections, when German commanders finally spoke freely. After the war, in camps across Britain, France, and the United States, Allied intelligence officers interviewed German tank commanders, many of whom had personally tested the Hellcat at Kummersdorf or fought against it in the Ardennes, Normandy, and Alsace. Time had softened their pride, and honesty finally had room to breathe. In one interview conducted in late 1945, Klaus Becker told his American interrogators, "We designed tanks for the war we expected. The Americans designed tanks for the war they intended to fight. They were correct. We were wrong." Another officer, Oberleutnant Schultz, spoke years later at a symposium in 1978. With a soft voice touched by decades of reflection, he said, "The Hellcat taught us a truth we did not want to see. 50 adequate weapons will defeat 10 excellent ones. we prized perfection. The Americans prized effectiveness. They won. These confessions were not excuses. They were acknowledgements, admissions that Germany's rigid doctrine had become a cage, while America's flexible, adaptive, industrial approach became a weapon. The legacy of the Hellcat, beyond steel and fire. When the war ended in May 1945, the world entered a new era of armored design. Nations studied everything, the mistakes, the victories, the philosophies that had shaped the most destructive conflict in human history. The United States built on the lessons of the Hellcat, creating lighter, faster anti-tank vehicles, and later, during the Cold War, concepts centered around mobility, rapid reaction, and adaptability. The Soviet Union studied it too, realizing that speed and firepower could coexist without heavy armor. But perhaps the most poetic irony came from West Germany. The nation that once worshipped heavy armor, thick steel, and engineering magnificence, designed the Leopard 1. A fast, mobile, flexible tank. Not a Panther, not a Tiger. A machine that moved with the spirit of the Hellcat. Speed over weight. Mobility over mass. Agility over rigidity. The future had arrived. The human truth behind the machine. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Hellcat was not technical. It was human. It reminded the world that courage is not always armored. Strength is not always heavy. And survival sometimes belongs to the soldier who refuses to fight on the enemy's terms. The American crews who rode the Hellcat into battle didn't just command a machine, they commanded possibility. They believed in movement, in initiative, in choosing when to fight and when to vanish. They fought with creativity, boldness, and a belief that speed could save lives even in the darkest days of the war. And they proved something profound. Sometimes, the greatest armor is the ability not to be hit at all. The final word, Becker's last reflection. When Becker was released from Allied custody in 1947, he returned to a broken homeland. During one of his final interviews, an American officer asked him what he believed the Hellcat truly represented. Becker paused for a long moment, looking out a window toward the ruins of post-war Germany. Then he said softly, "It showed us the future, and it showed us that the future belongs to those who move faster than fear."